2 years ago, I was connected to the club through Alfred, and someone he knew that Margaret knew, sort of. And I was initially hired on for the goal of two general things. One, to help out with general duties that Brian does, and two, to compile and compose a history of the club, a comprehensive history of the club. And that's what I've been doing. And soon after I first started, Brian gave me this lofty title of assistant director, which was nice. I essentially kept what I was doing, but doubled the hours from 4 hours to 8 hours a week. And most of the time that I've been spent on history has been done during the summers. I'm being filmed. Has been done during the summers because during the season, my 8 hours gets filled really quickly with reservations. So I did work scanning some of our old documents. One big mystery that Brian wanted to solve was where our earliest documents are, and if we have any. And the earliest documents we have here in this building are from 1945. Some are copies of things from earlier, but there's no original document from before 1945 that I'm aware of. And so this left a kind of dark space in the history of the club that we knew of. And also, there have been some tiny bits of histories written by former presidents, and compiled by oral reports and things that were passed down that, while nice to read, haven't always been so accurate. Sometimes there are things that haven't been true that have been passed down. So I was able to use a variety of sources to fill in this mystery period between 1911 and 1945. And Frank LaForge, who I'm sure you know of, was our president at the time of when things start becoming a lot more detailed. And when I say detailed, we have every board meeting minutes, every minutes of board meetings, and we have programs and flyers. But to fill in this gap, I used newspaper clippings. I used bits from books, articles from magazines, and general histories and biographies from tangential sources, topics, like people who were part of the club, or places that the club performed or were involved with. And I did find out a lot. So I'm sure you all know that Walter Damrosch was early involved in the club. I've seen written before in some of our records that Damrosch founded the club, which is not true, unfortunately. That'd be nice. He joined the club very early on. And one thing that I noticed really early on in the period of the club, which is different from how it is today, and how it has been, I guess, since about the 50s, is that it mainly served to entertain and bring connections between an existing group of people in an existing, already flourishing musical scene in New York, and I guess for the country at large. One problem that existed at the time, which is less pronounced today, but was pretty severe back then. I guess I shouldn't say problem, but it was a reality. Was that American composers, and particularly conductors and performers, were severely underrepresented in concert halls and in all sorts of musical organizations. Even American-born composers were typically performers, and conductors and composers were typically trained in Europe. So one thing that the club wanted to do was to champion and showcase people who were composers who were American, and provide support for performers who were American. But the first part of that was realized pretty early on. The second part took a few decades to actually flourish, because in the 1910s, it was kind of in this period that people were calling the golden age of music, and there wasn't really, people were pretty optimistic, but after the Great Depression and the Second World War, things changed quite a bit. And so, whereas the first few decades, what it seemed like was you'd have a really big name president, like Walter Damrosch, who would do a lot more things, and the club was probably one of the smaller things that they did, would provide a big name for the club and attract a lot of people, and when you go to their events, you're with a lot of really famous people, and that was really cool. And I've seen photographs of dinners of the club, and you see like Caruso in the audience, for example, and they're all having dinner and they're schmoozing, and it's great. But that's not very philanthropic. So it's really cool to read about, but we were able to do more, and we were glad that we did more. And pretty soon on, we realized that it wasn't enough just to do that. And once Frank LaForge became president, it became very evident that that shift was imminent. The president right before him, Henry Hadley, was someone a bit like Damrosch, not quite as famous, but he was nationally known composer, and he was like a big shot. And I don't have records to show, but he probably was often doing other things than being at club meetings. But Frank LaForge was really well known, but he was also really involved in the club, and he was in the club for almost 20 years as a president. So he was famous for his teaching and his accompanying as a pianist, but he also did compositions and arrangements. But that wasn't what he was famous for. It was mostly for his teaching and for his skills as an accompanist. So, but what he had, one of his big passions was supporting students, because he was a teacher. And you see in his autobiography or his memoirs that this is something he brings up quite a bit, is really making sure that young children have the resources that are needed and the encouragement that is required for them to eventually become potentially a musician, a successful one. And you see very specifically in board meetings, LaForge being the person to bring up certain ideas that push this idea forward. And in the 40s, we started doing philanthropic work by donating money to certain schools, and then it became donating money to people who had applied and supporting them as they went to like Tanglewood or I forget the name of the school, but there's a settlement school in
3rd Street.
3rd Street, yeah, 3rd Street Music School. Is that what it is?
3rd Street Settlement.
Yeah, I think that was one of the earliest things that we donated money to. But very quickly, and this was happening just as Frank LaForge was ending his. Well, he didn't end. He actually tragically passed away. Interestingly, while performing at a Musicians Club concert, he died on stage, and so he had left quite a strong legacy. And there was a really kind of difficult period after he died, because he was he filled the role so well. It became a few years before we actually had a president that stayed on for more than a few years. Norman Della Gioia was very involved, but he was only there for 3 years, and in his 3rd year, he had just won a Pulitzer Prize, and he very rightly wanted to focus more on composition. But during this period, which was really run by you guys, the board members, they really wanted to champion LaForge's ideals and support more young artists. And instead of just putting a little bit of money into certain funds and donating to certain schools, they decided to establish something that the club was controlling entirely, which was the Young Artist Awards. And it took a while, kind of the transition between the scholarships into the Young Artist Awards, which were initially called the Scholarship Awards, is quite fascinating, actually, when you read how it happened. And you see it very clearly on this one evening. Everything was really fleshed out. It hasn't changed much since 1955. And it started out by doing, I think the voice was the first one, and then the rotating instruments started from the very beginning, and we still have it to this day. And that, of course, it became one of the big things that we do. The concerts, which we still do today, have been around forever. And now they're for free. Brian has asked about whether they've always been free. They've always been free for members, as far as I know, but I do have records that non-members have paid, at least from the 40s, probably sooner than that. But that's good. That means that we've evolved over time and given more opportunities to people and provided more for free. I know now we're asking donations, but it's just a donation. We're still providing something to the community. So in the 50s onward, our goals shifted, and that kind of narrative is something that I've really enjoyed fleshing out and finding sources for. The trouble is that we are a club, and we're not like Carnegie Hall, for example, or something that many people are familiar with through like seeing us on TV or like or any sort of like high profile arena. So it's hard to find sources that talk about the club. It's easy to find sources that are from the club and to see news clippings and stuff, but there's little mentioned about our club in the biographies of Damrosch or LaForge or other presidents. So it's tricky.